Greetings, Earthlings! Welcome back to 7th Street, and welcome to yet another Top 5 80s explosion. Still need to come up with a better title for this series. Anyhow, we're on to 1984. Let's just get into it. Chud. Chud is one of those movies that's something of an enigma. It is a cult classic, but a mainstream example of a cult classic. Chud is the type of cult classic that anytime you bring up the fact that you like 80s horror movies, someone always says, "Oh, well, do you like Chud?" It just seems to be one of those movies that everyone who grew up in the 1980s seems to remember. And Chud is a movie that's referenced quite regularly in popular culture these days. Everything from The Simpsons.
And that's when the chuds came at me.
Oh, Homer, of course you'll have a bad impression of New York if you only focus on the pimps and the chuds.
To Aqua Teen Hunger Force.
I'm a chud.
And what's that?
Well, if you ever listened or paid attention to me, you would know it's a cannibalistic humanoid underground dweller.
To South Park.
You could wind up a hideous, foul shadow of a creature, so terrifyingly ugly that you are forced to live in the sewers, only emerging at night to hunt for scraps of food.
The movie centers around 3 different main characters. George, an award-winning fashion photographer turned homeless lifestyle photographer, played by John Hurd, whom you might recognize from Home Alone, Home Alone 2, or The Sopranos. We have AJ, a soup kitchen owner, played by the great Daniel Stern, whom you might recognize from Home Alone, Home Alone 2, or Celtic Pride. And then there's New York detective Bosch, who's investigating the recent disappearances of the local homeless population. Detective Bosch is played by Chris Curry, whom you might recognize from this film.
Last shot.
Each of these 3 main characters have their own motivations for investigating the recent killings of the New York homeless that live beneath the streets in the sewers. Eventually, the 3 storylines meet up in a climax that reveals the culprit to be a race of radioactive chuds, or cannibalistic humanoid underground dwellers. Although opening with a doozy of a scene featuring a woman walking her dog alone at night, only to be dragged into the sewers by a pair of monster hands coming out of a manhole cover, Chud is surprisingly slow for being such a well-known 80s cult monster movie. But you know, I sort of think that works in the movie's favor. Throughout the first half of the film's runtime, you don't really see much of the chuds, instead focusing mostly on the mystery surrounding the disappearances. Once the chuds show up, the movie really becomes more of a goofy monster flick with a lot of fun moments and special effects, so you kinda get the best of both worlds. Chud is a staple of the 80s any way you look at it, and definitely deserves a spot on this list. Number 4, Children of the Corn.
Down on your knees, heretic!
Shut your mouth, Isaac. You broke Pride one apart from us!
In the last video, I mentioned that Stephen King owned the 80s, and this is just another example of that. Based on the short story of the same name, Children of the Corn tells the tale of a young couple, Bert and Vicky, whom, while driving cross-country to Bert's new job as a physician, accidentally strike a young boy who staggers out of the cornfield.
Hang on. Let me check. Let me check.
The little boy was the resident of the nearby microscopic town of Gatlin, which had unknowingly become the home to a death cult run by children who sacrifice anyone over the age of 19 to the demon known as He Who Walks Behind the Rose.
Seize him! Punish him! Cut him down! I command you! I am the word and the giver of his laws.
Children of the Corn is a grade A horror film that teeters back and forth between being fun and cheesy and at times genuinely disturbing. The movie's prologue being one of those disturbing scenes that comes right to mind, with all the children in the town slaughtering the adults with sickles, sling blades, and even shoving this guy's hand into a meat slicer. The cast is a pretty good collection of character actors, with Peter Horton and Linda Hamilton, whom is probably best known as Sarah Connor from the Terminator films, but the real showstopper is John Franklin, who plays Isaac, the small boy who leads the paganistic corn cult. Franklin was actually in his 20s when he played this role, but he suffers from a rare genetic defect that caused him to appear very young.
No, you dare not blaspheme! He will punish you! The jaws of hell will devour you! All of you!
Children of the Corn was so popular when it was released that it has spawned 10 sequels and counting, some of which are pretty damn good, and some are not so much. But the thing that I find really funny about this is, if you have the Night Shift collection of short stories by Stephen King in its hardback edition, the Children of the Corn short story only comes out to about 10 pages. That means that there are as many feature films as there are pages of original source material. That is frickin' awesome.
Your presence does profane this holy place. He will reckon with you.
Children of the Corn is one of those horror flicks that I feel would be a great starter film for someone who's just getting into the genre. For the most part, it's pretty appropriate for children, I suppose. There's not a lot of gore or cursing, there's no nudity, and the movie ends on an upbeat note, which is a lot different from the short story, which ends with Vicky having her eyes ripped out and corn stalks shoved into her sockets.
I did as you commanded! I was done!
Number 3, Friday the 13th, the final chapter. Wow, can you believe it? It's taken 4 long years for a Friday the 13th film to make a list. Now, don't get me wrong, I do genuinely like all the Friday the 13th films. I just don't love all of them. The first 3 are good, and in some ways, I find the second one to be slightly better than this one, but the final chapter is the first in this series to undoubtedly make a top 5 list for the respected year that it was released in. The final chapter is usually a big fan favorite among F-13 fans, and for good reason. The film was directed by the great genre filmmaker Joseph Zito, with stellar gore effects from the legendary Tom Savini, and a cast of well-known 80s actors like Crispin Glover and Corey Feldman, the latter of which portrayed the reoccurring F-13 character Tommy Jarvis, who is also a big fan favorite.
Someone left the front door open.
We're in the country.
Well, what happens if the psycho wanders in?
The day after the events of the third film, Jason Voorhees' body is taken to the local town morgue, but surprise, surprise, the immortal slasher of Camp Crystal Lake isn't dead. I guess he was just sleeping? So anywho, of course, Jason goes on the loose again, and he returns to the lake where he finds a group of teens having somehow rented a cabin mere meters from an active crime scene, and then of course he proceeds to pick them off one by one. Corey Feldman is for sure my favorite character in this movie, playing the aforementioned 11-year-old Tommy Jarvis, who lives next door to the rented cabin. This kid is a big-time monster movie fan and has all of these super cool horror movie props in his room. Oh, and I guess he likes to spy on naked girls from his window, and ends up saving the day by shaving his head and appearing to Jason as the younger version of himself.
Jason! Jason!
final chapter was supposed to be the last film in this franchise, definitively killing off Jason Voorhees, and even hinting that Tommy Jarvis would take the place as the new Camp Crystal Lake Killer. But, of course, like all movies that make a ton of money, a sequel was rushed into production almost immediately. This movie is a blast, though. I mean, you can certainly see why die-hard Friday the 13th fans love this movie. I have sort of a weird relationship with the F-13 series. I do really enjoy all of these films, more so when I was a kid than I do now, but each one holds a special place in my heart for sure. As some of you may know, I recently achieved one of my lifelong dreams of playing a supporting character in the new Friday the 13th Vengeance movie. I can't tell you guys how amazing it feels to have the honor of being sliced in half by the hockey-faced serial killer himself. Number 2, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Once again, the movie taking the number 2 spot on this list is probably one that should be taking the number 1 spot. A Nightmare on Elm Street is certainly the most well-made movie on this list, not to mention being the scariest. The only thing that holds this movie back, in my opinion, is the simple fact that it's more thought of as being a Freddy film rather than being its own thing. I know that hardly seems fair, but it's how I feel. A Nightmare on Elm Street suffers from the same curse that Gojira has, in that 'twas the series' silliness that ultimately killed the beast. If you're old enough to have seen this movie when it came out and can remember it as a standalone film, well, good for you, but unfortunately I was born in the 90s and was well aware of the Freddy character and his goofy antics long before actually seeing the movie, and sadly, it sorta depreciates the value of it ever so slightly. A Nightmare on Elm Street is really a flawless film only if you are able to separate it in your mind as its own entity and try your hardest to block out the knowledge of future prequels and sequels. Directed by the master of horror Wes Craven, A Nightmare on Elm Street tells the story of Nancy Thompson and her friends who are suffering from violent reoccurring nightmares, which all feature one common element: a disfigured serial killer with a glove made of razors. When one of the group is murdered while sleeping, Nancy realizes that she must stay awake and try to uncover the truth behind the phantasmic serial killer, Freddy Krueger.
Give me that damn thing. It even has his name written in it.
I'm not exactly sure what else I can say about this movie. It's a huge horror icon, not just of the 80s, but in general. Even if you've never seen this movie or any of the other 100 Nightmare films, you know exactly what it's about, and you're probably aware of the Freddy Krueger character. A Nightmare on Elm Street is an extremely well-crafted flick, which features some genuine creepy moments, like the classroom scene with Amanda Weiss in a body bag. Seriously, man, this scene gave me nightmares for like a week. Also, it's Johnny Depp's film debut, which has gotta count for something.
Miss Nude America's gonna be on tonight.
Well, how can you hear what she's going to say?
Who cares what she says?
We're talking about a grade A classic here that really doesn't need me to stick up for it. It can stand on its own as one of the most popular horror films ever made. Number 1, Night of the Comet.
Wow.
It's Valley Girls versus Comet Zombies. If you don't already love this 80s gem, I'm not sure that I can help you. Night of the Comet is one of the best movies ever made, man, and I'm not being hyperbolic. I truly believe that. Every time I watch this movie, which is more frequent than one might think, I find myself throwing my hands up in the air, wondering how this wasn't a bigger hit.
Look, Doris, like,
I'm 18, okay? And I can watch the comet wherever I want to watch the comet.
And then nowadays, with all the 80s nostalgia my generation has, I definitely think that it would have at least some sort of cult resurgence, but no, not really. And that's funny, because every time I show someone this flick for the first time, they love it. My girlfriend loves this movie. My dad loves this movie. It shouldn't be a hot take that I consider this to be one of the top 10 80s genre movies.
I'm not crazy, I just don't give a fuck.
I could talk about this movie forever, man. So I'm going to. The movie opens with a narration explaining that the Earth is passing through the tail of a comet, an event which has not occurred in 65 million years and coincided with the extinction of the dinosaurs. On the night of the comet's passage, large crowds gather outside for a party to witness the event. We then meet 18-year-old Regina, played by one of my great crushes, Catherine Stewart, who works in a movie theater where she, like any good Valley girl, neglects her job, instead pursuing the 6th highest score on the theater's Templar arcade game, which all other scores belong to her, except for number 6, which reads DMK.
This is really annoying.
Instead of going home after work, Regina stays with her boyfriend Larry, the theater's projectionist, to sneak back in so that he can loan out a reel of film for profit. In doing so, she ends up staying the night with him and missing the big event of watching the comet. Meanwhile, Reggie's 16-year-old sister Samantha, played by the immensely beautiful Kelly Maroney, this channel's personal favorite actress, while having an argument with her evil stepmother Doris, the two engages in one of the greatest on-scene exchanges of fisticuffs that I've ever seen.
Looks like a real nice crowd we have out here tonight.
After getting her shit rocked, Sam ultimately spends the night in a steel backyard shed, also missing the comet.
Hey, where have you been? You're gonna miss everything. It's the start.
Oh, kids. I'll never marry another man with kids.
The next morning, a gloomy reddish haze covers the sky, and there are no signs of life, just piles of red dust and heaps of clothing everywhere. Unaware that anything has occurred, Larry goes outside and is immediately killed and eaten by a zombie wielding a pipe wrench. Must have been a hungry guy, because when Reggie comes out after him, all that's left of Larry is just this big ham bone. Anyhow, Reggie escapes on Larry's motorcycle and heads home to find her sister. This is one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie. I'm not sure exactly why I love it so much. I think that it's just the acting chops and the chemistry between Catherine and Kelly here. It makes me smile every time I watch it.
God, you look terrible.
I ran away last night after she slugged me.
Left a note and everything. But I didn't have any place to go, so I spent the night in the lawn storage shed.
Pretty gross with the snare all and everything.
God, look at this kitchen. I'm not cleaning this up.
The two teens come to the conclusion that because they both spent the night in steel containers, they were saved from the comet's effect. They then end up racing over to the local radio station, where they come upon a survivor named Hector, who explains he spent the night in the back of a panel truck and the next morning found some zombies eating his hooker friend. Nice.
I spotted her about 20 minutes later. Looked like one of those things had...
What?
torn her apart.
Hector ends up dipping out and running into more zombies, while Reggie and Sam hit the mall with some brand new Mac 10 9mm and have a shootout with infected zombie stock boys.
Attention, shoppers. I trust you've got credit cards to pay for all that stuff.
Night of the Comet eventually climaxes with a big battle between some scientists who plan to harvest the girls' blood and our heroes. Guess who wins? evils of what's left of the world are defeated, Reggie pairs up with Hector and takes parental roles over some kids that they rescued along the way, and Sam feels left out. That is until she ignores a do not walk signal light on a deserted street and is almost run over by a sports car driven by a teen survivor named Danny Mason Keener. After apologizing, he invites her to go for a ride, and as they drive off, the car is shown sporting the initials DMK.
And you, DMK, your history.
This movie is pure gold. Just go watch it.
The legal drinking age is now 10, but you will need ID, let's be real. I'll be taking requests from all you teenage COMET zombies on the hit line. That's 555-4487. Get it? 555 hits.
Well, guys, that was my top 5 favorite horror movies from the year 1984. Now, I know that a lot of you guys probably have a problem with my list, and that's okay. That's the great thing about having an opinion is, you know, it's just an opinion. It's not the law of the land. But, of course, I am interested to see what your guys' favorite horror films from 1984 are. Make sure that you leave a comment below. Make sure that you subscribe to this channel. I missed my finger there. Make sure that you like this video and, you know, shoot me a message. Follow us on Facebook and on Instagram and Patreon. And, shoot me a message and stuff. I always like hearing from you guys. Until next time.
Back off. The sweater cost $80. Muffy?